following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Every day, citizens around the country are faced with new dilemmas that affect them profoundly. Whether it's injustice, discrimination, falling through the cracks, scandals and cronyism, balances of power, ethics, religious freedoms, state versus citizens, and unfunded mandates, and the list goes on and on and on. Welcome to Speak Up. It's directed at those who have fallen through the cracks, and it gives them a voice. It's your turn to speak up. To stand up and fight back. Welcome to Speak Up. I'm Kevin Avard, State Senator here in New Hampshire, District 12. Today is another special edition, and we're going to be talking again about the death penalty because there's going to be some legislation introduced in the next day or so that will address the situation with the death penalty. Not necessarily a repeal, but a pause. And a pause for very good reason. There have been numerous exonerees over the last few years, and before it becomes a problem in New Hampshire, we want to address it. And so today I've invited a fellow from Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah, I keep messing the Sam. So Sam Millsap.
Right.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank
Sam, you flew all the way out here to be testifying on the bill tomorrow that we're going to be talking about. And your background is?
Well, I'm a lawyer, and but back in the 1980s, I was the elected district attorney in San Antonio. And in that position, I prosecuted death penalty cases. I was a strong supporter of the death penalty really until about 15 years ago. And anyway, I prosecuted several death penalty cases. Everybody that I prosecuted has been executed. And but in any event, back in 2005, the Houston Chronicle did an investigation, a three-part series that focused on one of my cases. And their conclusion was that the defendant in that case was probably innocent. And I looked at the case. Of course, it had been 30 years since I prosecuted it, and I really didn't have any memory of it. But when I looked at the case, the thing that I realized was that those people, when I ran for district attorney, I was very young. I was the youngest major metropolitan district attorney in the country when I was DA. I was the youngest when I was elected. I was still the youngest when I left office. And one of the knocks on me when I was in office and also when I was running was that I was too young, that I didn't have enough experience. And I never believed that that was true until I went back and looked at the file in that death penalty case, because the thing that I saw was that I had made a terrible mistake. I had prosecuted a young man on the basis of the testimony of a single eyewitness. We had no physical evidence. We had a compelling witness. Everybody believed him. I believed him. The jury believed him. Cantu was convicted. He was executed. Everybody forgot about Cantu until 2005 when our star witness recanted his trial testimony. And so that's what brings me to this fight. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's a fight. I think the death penalty is that we should do everything we can to make it part of our history. I think there's little good that comes from killing people because we think that somehow is going to keep others from killing people. And so that's why I'm here. I'm happy to be in New Hampshire and to testify in support of this bill.
When you first discovered that you possibly made a mistake and maybe came to the conclusion that, you know, the probability you did, did you further try to find out who actually did the murder, or?
Well, part of the problem that we had, I was out of office and had been out of office for 20 years when I realized that I had made a mistake. I've never been convinced, and I should be real clear about this, I've never been convinced that the fellow that the Houston Chronicle focused on was actually innocent. I think there's a good chance that he was innocent. The fact that our star witness recanted his testimony is not persuasive to me. I mean, the only thing that you know when somebody recants his testimony is that he's somebody that can't be trusted because he either lied originally or he's lying now. What was persuasive to me, though, and the thing that has really always bugged me about the Cantu case is that there was another guy that was with the shooter the night that this crime was committed. There was never any question about who he was. And the Houston Chronicle interviewed him. He was in prison in 2005 when they did their work, and they interviewed him. And one of the things that he was very clear about was that the person that we had prosecuted, Reuben Cantu, was simply not the shooter. And he had nothing to gain by saying that. It's not like his sentence was going to be shortened or something. And that's what bothers me. It's not the recantation. It's the fact that this other fellow who was in prison but who had nothing to gain has indicated that Cantu was not the guy.
So there was no circumstantial evidence that would have brought him into. And can
We
you
had
tell me
no-
a little bit about circumstantial evidence?
Sure.
Is that just a stronger type of evidence as opposed to eyewitness, or?
Well, most people sort of poo-poo circumstantial evidence, and there's a tendency to think of circumstantial evidence as not being as compelling or as persuasive. Circumstantial evidence is often absolutely dispositive, and I'll give you just a real simple example. I mean, if you're walking through the woods and you see a tree stump, a place where a tree has been cut down, and there's a stump that remains, and it's 3 or 4 feet above the ground, and what you see in the middle of that tree stump is a turtle. You haven't seen anything except the fact that turtle is there, and yet the thing that you can be absolutely sure of is how that turtle got there, and that's circumstantial evidence. But it's very persuasive. It's not. It's often more persuasive than physical evidence, and because the thing that we know now is that eyewitness testimony is so often unreliable, it's, I think, of greater value typically than eyewitness testimony is.
Now, we've heard about a case, actually there were about 40,000 cases of DNA being tampered with in one of our southern states. I think it was in Massachusetts, and the expert witness basically tampered with the evidence.
Right.
What do you do with a situation like that, with all those people that was part of their either circumstantial or physical evidence, and come to find out it was based upon false testimony?
Well, you have to go back and clean it up. And if you don't go back and clean it up, it's almost impossible, it seems to me, to justify your existence in public office. And when I say public office, I'm not talking about elected office. I'm talking about a public office that has the responsibility, whether it's a toxicology lab or a coroner's office, and is trusted to do this testing and then to go into the courtroom and to share with the jury those results. And when you have corruption, and we've had it in Texas, by the way. When you said a southern state, I thought maybe you were talking about Texas, but you said Massachusetts. We don't think of Massachusetts as being a southern state.
I was being polite.
But you've got to clean it up. I mean, it's like one of the things that the DA in my community has done, and I'm so glad that he has, is he's created what he calls a conviction integrity unit. One of the things that we know is that our criminal justice system is not perfect. Mistakes get made. The system is driven by decisions that are made by human beings, and people make mistakes, even when they're doing their best to get it right. Mm-hmm. And so what he has recognized, and what one other DA in Texas has recognized, is that there have been too many instances in which we didn't get it right. And we have a moral obligation to go back and clean those things up if we can. Now, part of the problem, and the reason why I'm such an outspoken opponent of the death penalty, is that when you're talking about a robbery or a rape or a burglary conviction that was a wrongful conviction, arguably at least, you can undo that. You can't give somebody back the time that he or she spent in prison, but you can give that person freedom. When you've executed somebody, it's done, and you can't undo that. And the thing that we know, and there's no question about this, the thing that we know is that innocent people have been executed in this country. There are at least 2 or 3 that were innocent and have been executed in my state. My guy, the guy that I prosecuted in 1985, may well be one of those people. But there's no question that there are others. I mean, we've had at this point 156 people across the country that have been exonerated. People who fortunately had not been executed.
Right.
And have been exonerated.
Randy Steidel was basically on the...
Randy is a good example. Ray Crone.
And from what I understand with Randy's, his wasn't basically an accident. It was in my opinion, based on his testimony, it was a retribution for being a whistleblower. And that's frightening.
It is frightening.
That somebody has that much power over your life, and they can accuse you falsely. And when you're in that certain situation and you can't afford to get out of it, that's frightening.
Well, it really is scary because there is a tendency on the part of people generally to believe that law enforcement can be trusted. And while it's undoubtedly true that the vast majority of the folks who work in law enforcement, whether they're police officers or prosecutors, vast majority of those people are working hard, doing their best to get it right. But there are some exceptions, and the exceptions cause a lot of harm. There's not anything that is more corrosive than corruption in law enforcement. In Randy's case, I mean, you've got a guy who was just literally framed. There are too many other examples that are like his case, but there is. I can remember a time when I didn't believe that it was possible for law enforcement to engage in the kind of behavior that victimized Randy Steidel. I would have said naively 5 or 6 years ago that couldn't happen.
His own brother said the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. That's right.
The police aren't wrong, or the prosecutor's not wrong. And I think the thing that strikes me, if you don't mind, about his case is that the prosecutor got promoted to Veterans Affairs. And this level of accountability for those who have such power over your life.
Yeah.
Is again, it's something to consider. So again, we've introduced some legislation to put a pause on it. In your testimony tomorrow, what will you bring forward?
Well, the thing that I'm going to emphasize, I'm going to build on my own case. I'm going to use my case as sort of a centerpiece for the argument that the legal system is actually capable of getting it wrong. I'm going to go from there, and I'm going to talk about 3 Texas cases in which there is no question that the defendants in those cases were innocent and they have been executed. And the basic question that I'm going to put to the members of the Senate panel tomorrow, and then I put to the people of New Hampshire generally, is what degree of certainty are we going to require? For me, and there are good people, by the way, who disagree with me on this, who believe that there's a certain amount of risk that ought to be accepted as just part of the system. But I don't. I don't think it's good enough when you're talking about the death penalty, when you're talking about a sanction that is so final, to be satisfied with a legal system that can only boast that it gets it right most of the time. If you knew when you were getting on your airplane tomorrow that the only thing that you could be sure of is that you will probably get where you're going, because most of the time airplanes take off and land safely, you wouldn't get on that airplane. And yet at the same time, when we talk about the death penalty, it seems that standard is okay, that we're satisfied if we get it right most of the time. Well, I'm going to suggest tomorrow when I testify that that's not good enough. That we have to know that we're getting it right, because one of the things that we promised when we created our legal system in this country and when we agreed to give the government this incredible power that they have, we promised ourselves, we promised each other that our courts would guarantee the protection of the innocent. And to the extent that we fail to do that, even if it's only one time, we haven't kept that promise. And I think it's very important that that promise be kept.
You know, there are about 3 other questions that I've run across from my colleagues, and one of them brought up the fact that our founders created this jury system. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to tell me that the jury's going to get it wrong. And I'm just considering that, and I'm thinking, well, what is the process of picking the jury pool for cases like this on capital punishment? Are they foolproof?
No, of course not. No,
that
no
is
jury.
a rhetorical question, obviously,
right.
but
yeah, no, and I mean part of the reason why we have an appellate process is because what we recognize that juries can make mistakes. Now, what doesn't happen in death penalty cases is that appellate courts don't typically look at the question of whether the defendant was innocent. I mean, that's a fact question that has already been determined. But our appellate courts are often looking at the question of whether there was enough evidence to justify the jury in its decision, or whether the jury just ignored the overwhelming weight of the evidence. I mean, there's no question that juries sometimes make mistakes. And in my case, for example, if Reuben Cantu was actually innocent, they made a mistake in that case. It was a mistake for which they absolutely bear no responsibility, because the only thing that they did was what I told them they had to do, that they had to convict him. There was no evidence that suggested anything other than that, and they did. And
he didn't have Johnny Cochran defending him.
Well, and even if he'd have had Johnny Cochran defending him, we still would have won.
Right. Another discussion that we had, one of them, my senator colleague said, well, if I could only be sure that they would not be paroled, how can I trust the courts that they're not going to let this person out? And if you digest that reply, mm-hmm. That's pretty frightening anyway. Well, think about it.
It is frightening.
We're going to kill him just in case.
Yeah. Well, it is frightening, and the thing about it is that your colleague, I mean, there's really nothing that anybody can say to him or her that will provide the kind of assurance that he or she requires, because first of all, you've got life without parole. We have life without parole in Texas. I assume that it means the same thing here in New Hampshire that it means in Texas, and what it means in Texas is that the person who is sentenced to life without parole dies behind bars, period. That's the end of the process. Now, and so as long as the legislature leaves the law the way it is in a life without parole state, a person who is sentenced to life without parole is going to spend the balance of his or her natural life behind bars. What you can't ever be sure of, absolutely sure of, is that the legislature won't change the law at some point.
Right.
And so, but the point is that I think when you have somebody that establishes that kind of a standard, I don't know how you reach and create satisfaction in that situation.
Well, the underlining factor is she doesn't trust the courts.
Sure.
And that being said, that's an indictment in itself.
Sure.
There was
But
another.
that's an argument in favor I mean, if you don't trust the courts,
Correct.
that's an argument in favor of getting rid of a sanction that is so final. I mean, basically what you're saying is that the courts can't be trusted because they're not competent to make decisions like this.
And I guess there was another statement that was, again, you have to really think it through, but, whoa, we haven't executed somebody in so many years, and we really don't have that problem, which begs the question, so do we wait till we have the problem before we fix it? And again, I think the whole process of bringing this forward is so that we don't make a bad choice.
Amen.
And like you said, we've had over 150, 140
156 today, as of today.
exonerees, and of course we have Randy, and we're going to be interviewing somebody else who was another exoneree. And you know, when you consider your civil rights and the cruel and unusual punishment, for somebody to sit on death row being innocent, I would imagine that would apply. Just think of the horror and knowing, and of course everybody in prison's innocent, you know,
Yeah.
you know, so that you know what I'm saying.
Sure,
it's-
I do.
All their colleagues, if you will, or roommates would say, you know, yeah, I'm innocent too. It just leaves you in such an area of despair.
Yeah.
You know, the psychological damage, and how do you repay somebody for that? And if there was some dubious, you know, prosecutor, you know, doing this to you, it just makes it even harder. So.
I've never been one of those people who opposes the death penalty on moral grounds. I believe that there are some crimes that are so horrible that the only appropriate response from civilized people is execution. My opposition, and so I don't fall into that group that opposes it for moral reasons. My opposition is completely practical. Now, when I spent 4 or 5 years ago, I spent a weekend with 15 exonerees, and these are guys who had 3 things in common with each other. Number one, they had all been convicted of capital murder. Number two, they had all spent years and years and years on death row, in some cases more than 20 years. And the third thing that they had in common is that they were all innocent. All of them were innocent. And they were brought together, and I got to spend a weekend with these guys, and it was the most incredible weekend of my life. And when I left there was a moral component to my opposition to the death penalty, and what it had to do with, I mean, it seems to me that it is indefensible, that it is immoral to have a legal system in which you know that you're not getting it right in as often as you should. And number two, when you say to people like the men that I spent that weekend with, I'm sorry, but the mistake that produced the injustice that you had to live with is something that we're just going to have to put up with. That is immoral in my opinion. And so there is a moral component now to my position, but it doesn't have anything to do with the death penalty. It has to do with the way we treat people who have been victims of wrongful prosecutions. It's just indefensible.
And I told Randy this as well, that I grew up believing in the death penalty, and
I did too.
From a biblical perspective, and you know, from Cain, you know, killing his brother, and it was declared then that a man who sheds another man's blood, his blood shall be required. And as you go out through the whole Bible, you'll see instances where there's capital being put out, and so on and so on. And but just as equally as it shows that it's been carried out, if you do it wrongfully, that's an abomination. And it just struck me the other day, Proverbs, everybody likes to quote Proverbs, you know, there's a certain passage that says, "These 6 things doth the Lord hate, a proud look, lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood." And you know, when you're a kid, you say, "See, there's the capital punishment." Of course, you're not thinking it through, because the people are telling you that supports it. But my gosh, if you put somebody to death that is innocent, that's an abomination.
It is an abomination. We have one case in Texas, probably the most infamous case in Texas, in which we executed a man in which, you know, usually when you're talking about innocence, whether somebody was innocent or not, there's not any question about whether a crime was committed. You know, there's never any question about whether a crime was committed. But in this case, we've got the sort of dubious distinction of having executed somebody in Texas when there was no crime. We've got a guy that was indicted for arson. He was convicted. His kids were in the house burned to the ground. His kids were killed. He was indicted and convicted of capital murder. And what was determined after he was executed, he was convicted because of what we call expert testimony. But very often what we think of as expert testimony, when we learn more, turns out to be nothing more than just junk science. And there are lots of examples of that. This is one of them. But what was accepted is sort of, you know, the lore in fire investigations back in the day when that fire occurred is something that we now know was just bunk. And so today, in that case, we've executed a guy for the fact that he was in a fire, that he was in a house that accidentally caught on fire. And, you know, and it is an abomination. And in that situation, nobody actually did anything that was corrupt. We just weren't smart enough as a people to know that what we considered to be evidence of arson was simply evidence of nothing. And yet we use that kind of evidence, and we do it over and over again to justify putting people to death in capital murder cases.
Now, is there a movement across the country to either, not only just to abolish, but to set up safety nets, basically a safety net?
There is. Texas, of course, is the execution capital of the free world. We've executed, you guys, the last time you guys executed anybody here in New Hampshire was the year that Hitler marched into Poland. We've executed 532 people since 1976. We execute anywhere from 5 to 20 people a year. And yes, there is a movement. Unfortunately, it doesn't have quite as much momentum in Texas as I would like, but there is a movement, not only to abolish the death penalty, but also to clean the legal system up, and to look at some of these processes that have turned out to be nothing more than junk science, and try to figure out where we went wrong. We have a commission in Texas that has that as its mandate because of this arson case. The other case, by the way, that I'll talk about tomorrow is a similar kind of situation, and this is really, really a tragedy because we had a case, the Claude Jones case in Texas, in which the only thing that connected Claude Jones to the crime was a single human hair, one hair. And that hair was tested, and the guy that tested it marched into court, and he testified that the hair belonged to Jones. Jones was convicted. He was executed. This was back during the day before we had DNA testing. And after he was executed, they DNA tested this hair and determined that the hair had come from the victim's body. Now, does that mean that Jones didn't commit the murder? No, it doesn't. It doesn't eliminate that possibility. But what it does do is it establishes a situation where there is absolutely no evidence that connects him in any way to the crime, and that makes him innocent from a legal standpoint. How do you justify something like that? I mean, we have to be able to know that these processes that we use to evaluate evidence are reliable. And the only way to do that is to really, really look hard at it and do it on a systematic basis so that hopefully we don't make the same kinds of mistakes in the future that we've made in the past.
So, my wife and I, we like to go to bed and watch Discovery Channel or 48 Hours, and there's a whole list of them that we watch. And it wasn't shortly after Randy's interview, we watched an actor be brought in because of something that tied him to a crime. And what I learned through Randy's testimony is that police officers are immune. They can lie to you all day long.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular episode, they caught the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And they were lying through their teeth through them. And I had such mixed emotions about this. And I'm sure this is going to come up in testimony tomorrow. Because I really want to get at the truth of this and in a way to fix this or just shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
But they got the bad guy, and he is on death row. And he was an actor. He lied. They said, "Hey, we just want to exonerate you. Here, we're going to do a swab test." Okay, they were lying through their teeth, but they got the DNA. Then they said, "Well, this person said something," and they were lying through their teeth, but they got a confession. Then there's mixed feelings about these false confessions, but it happened to be in his particular case, at least according to this documentary, that he was the perp. He eventually did, it all came together. But there are other instances where people are being lied to, and they feel, well, I'll just confess, and this will all go away. And are you familiar with these types of situations?
Oh, yeah. There's nothing more frightening to me, and nothing that I would have considered more unlikely to happen as recently as 10 years ago as somebody confessing to a crime that he or she had not committed. In fact, I mean, it was not very long ago that I didn't believe it could happen, but it does happen, and it happens too frequently. It happens for a whole variety of reasons, but it happens.
And the police officers were using this tool, and so if they can't use the tool, well, hey, you're going to be put on the death penalty. I know there's going to be testimony that says, well, you're taking that tool away from us. What are your thoughts about that?
Taking the death penalty as a tool away?
Yeah.
Well,
to get a confession or cooperation.
Well, first of all, it's true that tool will be taken away. But one of the things that I've run into in other states where I've testified and where I've worked is prosecutors who make the argument that oh my God, we've got to have the death penalty for plea bargaining purposes. And so the thing that I would say to anybody, any police officer, for example, who says don't take the death penalty away from me because it'll tie my hands, is the same thing that I say to prosecutors who make the same argument, and that is that it is fundamentally unethical to use a hammer like that to try to secure a confession from somebody. I mean, what you do when you use a hammer like that in an effort to secure a confession, you only raise the possibility, you only increase the likelihood that confession will be a false confession. One of the things that happens most frequently, or has happened most frequently in these false confession situations, is that we find out that somebody confessed to a crime that he didn't commit because he was afraid that he would spend more time in jail, or because he was afraid that if he didn't confess that he would get the death penalty. And the reason why he was afraid was because his lawyer told him that the evidence was against him. And what all of this points up, I mean, in the context of what we're doing right now, what all of this points up is the fact that there is absolutely nothing about our legal system that is foolproof. You know, we've put together the greatest legal system in the world, and it really is the greatest system in the world. But when you really look at it closely, the thing that you see is that it's held together by chewing gum and wire and string, and there is no guarantee in any case that that we're going to get it right. There are too many moving parts. There are too many players. And when you have those players and they're all doing their best and they're all working hard, the potential for error is still there. And so, okay, when you accept that, then the next question becomes, okay, are we going to rely on a system that has that much potential for error to decide whether somebody should live or die?
Right.
And to me, the answer is so simple. You just don't do it. And life without parole really does mean what it says. You know, if you take somebody who would otherwise be executed and you lock that person up for life, that person is going to stay in prison for life. The community is going to be safe. There is simply no risk. And it makes so much more sense, it seems to me.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this, and it's a long flight, and welcome to New Hampshire. Hopefully you'll get to see some politicians hanging around the corner. I know we've seen our share of them, but it means a lot that you're coming to testify on this, and I hope that it'll shed a lot of light and that it'll persuade one or two more of my colleagues.
Well, I understand we only need one or two more, I hope, at
I
least.
think that's all we need.
All right. Well, I'm going to go get them. I'll tell you, I'm ready to boogie. Let's do it.
All right. Wonderful. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
All right.
I enjoyed it.
And thanks for watching Speak Up. We hope that this helps you in your understanding of what's going on here. We did introduce some legislation, I did, to bring into question the whole process. Because after all, like I said, on a moral basis, it's an abomination to shed blood on somebody who's innocent. So, until next week, thanks for watching Speak Up. And if you have a story, contact me, Kevin Avard, at speakupnh@gmail.com. Until then.